Part of a conversation at the information desk in the library.
Hi, can I help you?
Where do I go, besides the computers, to look for books on New Zealand?
Okay, you mean you don't want to use the computer?
Well, I haven't had any luck on the computers here.
Okay. I mean, the reason I'm asking is you pretty much have to go to the computer to find out where a book is. But I can help you find it on the computer if you like.
That would be great. I just spent half an hour and I couldn't find anything.
I know how you feel. When I first started working here, I couldn't find anything either. So you're looking for information on New Zealand, is that right?
Yes.
Is it like travel information that you're looking for?
No, actually what I'm looking for is information on a volcano in New Zealand.
Oh, okay. Because I know a travel agency that specializes in tours to New Zealand and Australia.
Oh, I'd love to go. I've heard it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Maybe someday.
Yep. Okay, let's see. Okay. If you want to search the library holdings and don't know the author's name or the exact title of the book or an article, you have to set up a keyword search. It's a special function. Then you can just type in some keywords and let the computer do the search.
I see.
Okay, or how about if we search for volcanoes and New Zealand?
Sounds good.
Is this for a geology class?
Mm-hmm.
Ha! You must be in Professor Simpson's class.
No.
Oh. Well, he's a volcano expert, so I thought he might be teaching your class.
No, I've heard he's really good, though.
Yeah, that's what everyone says. Do you know the name of the volcano?
Mount Ruapehu.
Can you spell that?
Sure. It's Ruapehu.
Okay. Mount Ruapehu. Let's see. So, are you a geology major?
Hardly.
Let me guess. You have to take a science course and you don't want to have to deal with biology, chemistry, or physics.
Exactly. But it's actually turned out to be a pretty interesting class.
Well, that's good. Now, does it have to be a book, or could you use a journal article?
No, either one would be fine.
Okay, well, here's a journal article. Let me check to see if we have it. Okay, we have the article, but it's from 2001. Is that okay, do you think?
Well, I'd like to have a look at it. The focus is really on eruptions in the last 5 years, but it might have some useful background material.
Okay, well, let's see what else we can find.
Sounds good.
Why does the woman go to the information desk? Why does the man assume that the woman is in Professor Simpson's class? What can be inferred about the geology course the woman is taking? What topic does the woman need information on? What does the man imply about the article when he says this?
Okay, we have the article, but it's from 2001. Is that okay, do you think?
Listen to part of a lecture in a marine biology class.
So, we've been fairly thorough in our discussion about coral reefs, which of course are prominent oceanic features made of hard limestone skeletons produced by tiny coral animals. We've gone over where coral reefs are usually formed, along the edges of shallow ocean banks in tropical or subtropical regions, and the fact that they're declining at an alarming rate. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that all is lost. There are several techniques being employed today that could prove useful in assuring the future of the reefs. Now, we've talked in depth about coral bleaching or whitening, which, as you'll recall, is a symptom of, well, that the coral is suffering. As you know, coral is very sensitive to water temperature. Even a 1 or 2 degrees Celsius rise in sea surface temperature for a relatively short amount of time can cause bleaching. Recently, researchers have used data collected by monitoring surface water temperatures to improve the ability of a reef to recover from bleaching. One future possibility is that improved monitoring can help predict where and when bleaching will occur, which might potentially enable us to mitigate its effects. And there's another technique that's being experimented with to try to help coral reefs recover from bleaching. It's called coral transplantation. This involves moving young coral from a healthy reef onto a degraded reef, in an attempt to regenerate the degraded reef by encouraging young, healthy coral to take over. There has been some success with this, but it's still somewhat controversial. Some scientists support it because, well, for one thing, it means you don't have to rely on the existing coral to reestablish itself, because it might not be able to. But in my opinion, transplanting coral should only be used as a last resort. I mean, this method is not only costly, but even if it's successful, it still fails to address the ongoing problem, the root causes of the degradation, which really is paramount to devising an effective solution. So I don't really take comfort in the successes that they've had with transplantation. Perhaps a more constructive use of our time could be spent researching corals that do survive, like in areas known as refugia. Refugia are areas on the reef that are seemingly, resistant to bleaching. See, when coral reefs experience bleaching, it's rarely a case of the whole reef being affected. There are almost always pockets of coral on the reefs that remain unaffected, and these are often the lower areas of the reef, those located in deeper water where temperatures are lower. Now, we have evidence that corals in these locations are able to escape the destructive bleaching that affects portions of the reef in shallower, warmer water. So in my mind, it's these refugia that are the key components of overall reef resilience. These should be the area of concentration for researchers to locate and protect those regions as a way to sustain coral reefs. And we can also protect reefs by protecting the surrounding ecosystems, like mangrove forests and seagrass beds. Both of these grow in coastal waters, often in the vicinity of coral reefs. By protecting these areas, we also protect the coral. Let's take, for example, the mangrove forests. Mangrove root systems have the ability to absorb and, trap sediments and pollutants in water that flows through them before they enter the ocean. This, of course, has beneficial results for the nearby coral reefs. And fisheries management is another key strategy. Overfishing can be seriously disruptive to coral. Let me give you a couple of examples. Overfishing certain species of fish and shellfish like snappers, barracudas, and even lobsters, well, all of these creatures feed on snails, worms, and other organisms that eat coral. So depleting the number of lobsters, for example, means that we're adding to the threat of coral decline. Sea urchins are another example. They eat algae and prevent it from overwhelming the coral. Since the disappearance of sea urchins from the waters off the coast of South Florida, many coral reefs there have been smothered by the uncontrolled growth of algae.
What is the lecture mainly about? According to the professor, how might researchers predict the onset of coral bleaching in the future? What is the professor's opinion about coral transplantation? Why does the professor discuss refugia? What does the professor imply about the impact of mangrove forests on coral reef ecosystems? According to the professor, what effect do lobsters and sea urchins have on a coral reef? Listen to part of a lecture in a history of musical instruments class.
So, musical instruments evolved in ways that optimize their acoustical properties, how the instrument vibrates and sends those vibrations through the air to our eardrums. Now, professional musicians are very particular about their instruments. They want instruments that help them fully express the intent of the composer, which, of course, translates into a more enjoyable listening experience for the audience members. Yet, most audience members probably aren't even aware of how much the instrument matters. I mean, okay, think about the last concert you attended. When you applauded, what went through your mind?
I recently heard a violinist who totally blew me away. So when I applauded, I guess I was showing my appreciation for his skill, the hours of practice he must have put in.
And his violin?
Didn't really think about it. It looked exactly like mine, which is inspiring in a way, knowing my violin could also produce such beautiful tones that maybe I'll sound that good someday.
I hope you do. But if your violin isn't as good as his...
You mean he might not sound as good playing my violin?
As I said, tone quality differs from instrument to instrument. The question is, why? Why does one instrument sound more beautiful than another, even if they look identical? There's a particularly interesting case with an extraordinary generation of violins made in northern Italy, in the city of Cremona, back in the late 1600s, early 1700s. These vintage Cremonese violins are considered the best in the world, but it's not like the makers of those violins were any more skilled than their modern-day counterparts. They weren't. Today's top violin makers can pretty much replicate all of the physical attributes of a Cremonese violin, but it's generally thought that the acoustical quality of modern violins doesn't live up to the quality of the vintage ones.
So, what attributes of the old violins have been replicated?
Oh, their dimensions, shape, their fingerboard height, general craftsmanship. For a long time, people thought the varnish used to coat and protect the violins was special, but research showed it was the same ordinary varnish used on furniture. However, researchers have discovered that there's something special about the wood the violins were made from, and recently they've been able to replicate that too.
How? Unless the trees the Cremonese used are still alive.
The trees weren't replicated, just the wood, specifically the wood's density. Density is determined by how trees grow. Trees, all trees that don't grow in the tropics, grow seasonally. They grow faster early in the year, in the springtime, than they do later in the year. So early growth wood is relatively porous. Late growth wood is denser, less porous. And this variation shows up in the tree's growth rings. The denser layers are generally darker than the less dense layers. We call this variation the density differential. Variations in wood density affect vibrations and therefore sound. When scientists first analyzed the wood of vintage Cremonese violins and compared it with the modern violin wood, they calculated the average density and found no difference. Later, other researchers measured the density differential and found a significant difference. Modern violins had a greater variation, a larger differential.
So you mean the density of the wood in the Cremonese violins is more uniform?
Correct.
But northern Italy isn't in the tropics.
No, but climate matters. Turns out the Cremonese violins were made from trees that grew during a little ice age, a period when temperatures across Europe were significantly lower than normal. So the trees grew more evenly throughout the year, making the density differential relatively small.
But you said someone replicated the Cremonese wood.
The density differential was replicated.
What did they do? Try to simulate an ice age climate in a greenhouse and grow some trees in there?
No. What happened was a materials scientist figured out a way to process wood to make it acoustically similar to the Cremonese wood. He basically exposed the wood to a species of fungus, a mushroom. In the forest, fungi are decomposers. They break down dead wood. But this particular fungus nibbles away only at certain layers in the wood, leaving other layers alone. As a result, the density differential of the fungi-treated wood approached that of the Cremonese wood.
What does the professor mainly discuss? What does the professor imply about the best modern violin makers? Why does the professor discuss the growth cycle of trees? What factor accounts for the particular density differential of the wood used in the Cremonese violins? The professor describes an experiment in which wood was exposed to a fungus before being made into a violin. What point does the professor make about the fungus? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Most audience members probably aren't even aware of how much the instrument matters. I mean, okay, think about the last concert you attended. When you applauded, what went through your mind?
Why does the professor say this?
Okay, think about the last concert you attended. When you applauded, what went through your mind?
Listen to part of a conversation between a student and the professor of his history of technology class.
would it be okay to focus on something related to agriculture?
Sure, farming technology is fine, as long as it's pre-modern. But this isn't a long paper, so you're going to need to pick a specific area of pre-modern agriculture, like irrigation, or food crops of ancient Greece.
I'm actually interested in hydroponics.
Hydroponics, growing plants in water instead of soil.
Well, not in pure water. In water that has the proper mix of nutrients.
Okay, but is it a pre-modern technology? I mean, hydroponics isn't really my specialty, but from the research I've read, we're talking the 19th century, maybe the 17th century, if you really stretch it.
Oh? But the Aztec civilization back in the 13th century in basically where Mexico City is today, an article I read said the Aztecs were using hydroponics in something they called, I've got the word right here, chinampas.
Chinampas, the so-called floating gardens.
Exactly. So, yeah, the chinampas, the article said very clearly these floating gardens are proof that the Aztecs invented hydroponic farming.
Well, chinampas are artificial islands built up in shallow lakes, islands made from packed earth and weeds, and material from the bottom of the lake. They may have appeared to be floating in the water, but in fact they reach all the way to the bottom of the lake. So the primary growing medium, what the plants draw nutrients from, is actually soil, not water.
So the article was wrong about that? Too bad. It seemed like a great topic, but I guess...
Wait a minute. Just because chinampas were not technically hydroponic doesn't mean this couldn't be an appropriate topic for your paper. Chinampas were still a great pre-modern technological achievement. I mean, they enabled the Aztecs to grow plenty of food in an area without much available farmland.
But I wonder why the author wrote that chinampas were hydroponic.
Well, it's pretty common for writers to generalize. Say, use a term like hydroponics to describe other types of agriculture. Personally, I'd never say hydroponic except for plants growing in liquid. The crops on chinampas definitely benefited from the water surrounding them, but hydroponic...
Okay, so I'll go with chinampas, but leave out the hydroponics part.
Actually, there's an important lesson here. We should pay attention to what happened in history, but also how historical events are presented. Why, for example, would writers use a word like hydroponics so casually?
I guess 'cause it's a popular topic people want to read about?
Or, to help modern-day readers understand something historical, maybe these writers think a familiar frame of reference is needed.
Well, that article was in a popular magazine, not a scholarly journal for historians.
Okay, but historians sometimes do the same thing.
So I guess then that all historians might not describe chinampas in quite the same way either.
Good point. Why not look into that too, and include it along with your description and analysis?
Why has the student come to see the professor? What does the professor imply about hydroponics? Why does the professor describe how chinampas were made? What does the professor think about the article the student mentions? What additional information does the professor suggest that the student include in his paper?
Listen to part of a lecture in a studio art class.
Okay, as you probably know, primary colors are, theoretically speaking, the basic colors from which all other colors can be made. But as you'll find out when you start working on your painting projects, the three primary colors, red, blue, yellow, don't always make the best secondary colors. Combining red and blue, you'll probably never get a fantastic violet. To get a nice violet, you'll have to add white. Combining yellow and blue, you'll almost never get a satisfactory green. You're better off using a pure green pigment. The idea of primary colors, and specifically the idea of red, yellow, and blue being the primary colors, didn't exist until about 200 years ago. Until then, the dominant theory about color was one that had been proposed by Isaac Newton. Newton gave a scientific and objective explanation of colors. He used a prism to break white light down into the various colors of the spectrum, and he theorized, rightly so, that different colors are essentially different wavelengths of light. But he made no mention of primary colors. That idea came from, or was at least published, by a man named Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Goethe was a well-known author. He wrote many famous novels, plays, poems. So why did he start thinking about colors? Well, Goethe was part of the Romantic movement in Western literature, and he was a romantic through and through, meaning that he explained objects and phenomena in terms of the spiritual, emotional impact they had, as opposed to explaining them in terms of their scientific nature. He rejected an objective understanding of color in favor of a more subjective understanding. He believed that when we see color, it stimulates our emotions, and different colors appeal to or inspire different emotions in different people.
That sounds like psychology.
Well, color theory is used in psychology too. Some psychologists do use their field's version of color theory to diagnose and treat patients. Anyway, Goethe conducted a number of experiments trying to figure out which colors corresponded to which emotions, and in terms of that goal, he wasn't very successful. But his experiments actually did show a lot about the relationships between colors themselves, about how colors change when placed next to other colors, about how they interact with one another. Scientists studying optics and chromatics today still marvel at his findings. but Goethe wasn't really able to establish a clear connection between colors and emotions. Then, in 1806, he received a letter from a relatively unknown German artist, a painter named Philipp Otto Runge. In the letter, Runge outlined his own color theory, specifically the connections he made between colors and emotions. And his ideas about what colors symbolized, about the emotions that different colors inspired, were based on the colors red, yellow, and blue. Runge's choice of red, yellow, and blue had nothing to do with what we know from modern-day chromatics. It had to do with Runge's complex system of symbolism, his experience of nature, particularly with his experience of the quality of light at various times of the day, morning, noon, and night. So each color had a specific symbolic value. Well, 4 years later, Goethe published a book entitled Color Lesson. In Color Lesson, Goethe, coincidentally, cites the same colors as primary colors. At this point, Goethe was already a well-known author, so he was easily able to popularize this idea of primary colors, and specifically the idea of red, yellow, and blue as the primary colors.
But he didn't mention Runge?
Well, he did put Runge's letter in the book, at the end. But he added a disclaimer implying that Runge's letter didn't influence his work. Apparently, what Goethe was saying was that they just happened to come up with the same theory at the same time.
What is the lecture mainly about? What does the professor imply about the usefulness of the theory of primary colors? Why does the professor mention Isaac Newton? According to the professor, what were the results of Goethe's experiments with color? According to the professor, why did Runge choose the colors red, yellow, and blue as the three primary colors? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Well, he did put Runge's letter in the book, at the end. But he added a disclaimer implying that Runge's letter didn't influence his work. Apparently, what Goethe was saying was that they just happened to come up with the same theory at the same time.
What does the professor imply when he says this?
Apparently, what Goethe was saying was that they just happened to come up with the same theory at the same time.